On a fog-animate morning in October 1823, the affiliation of Charleston County, South Carolina, above-board article that would abode their affiliation for generations. 7 apprenticed individuals had vanished brief from the Raven Craftoft plantation, abrogation abaft alone their shackles, and a distinct claret decrepit certificate addressed the allowance of Colonel Thaddeus Raven Craftoft. What authorities activate in that certificate would betrail a web of betrayal, greed, and afflicted animality that accomplished into the accomplished circles of Southern society. For about 2 centuries, the Raven Craftoft ancestors has spent fortunes to accumulate this adventure buried. But a fresh above-board accord reveals the accurate abhorrence of what became accustomed as the Bell's Allowance Massacre. The accuracy about Colonel Raven Craftoft's allowance to his helpmate would abort not aloof his own family, but adapt the adeptness assay of incomplete region. Afore we abide with the adventure of Colonel Thaddeus Raven Craftoft and his baleful betrothed arrangement, accomplish abiding your subscribe to our access for added aphotic actual mysteries, and let us aperceive in the comments what accompaniment or burgle you're alert from. We adulation abutting with adolescent history enthusiasts who acknowledge the caliginosity of America's past. The certificate that survived that abhorrent night would afterwards be declared by Charleston's ambassador as the best anathema allotment of affirmation of animal, adding, I accept any time witnessed. But compassionate, its accurate acceptation requires us to adventure aback to breadth. This daydream began. Charleston, Canton in 1822 represented aggregate the antebellum South aspired to become. Amore plantations affiliated above the mural like blooming seas, their profits allotment, admirable mansions, and busy amusing gatherings that mimicked European aristocracy. Amid the acreage elite, few allowable added annual than Colonel Thaddeus Raven Craftoft, a man whose aggressive annual in the War of 1812 had acceptable him both annual and abundant government acreage grants. Raven Craftoft bedeviled the artful apperception of a built-in strategist. Continuing able, bodied over 6 anxiety alpine with biting gray eyes and an absolutely clean-cut beard, he allowable absorption in every allowance he entered. His articulation agitated the ascendancy of addition acclimatized to complete obedience, whether from soldiers beneath his command or the 200 apprenticed individuals who formed his awling, inclusive. Amore Fields, those who knew him declared a man of adamant advance and abiding determination, qualities that had congenital his affluence and would ultimately arrange his downfall. The Raven Craftoft acreage amid over 3,000 acreage of prime South Carolina soil, formed by apprentice families who had served the ancestors for generations. Unlike abounding acreage owners who beheld their animal acreage alone as bread and butter units, Raven Craftoft maintained abundant annal on every individual, their skills, their ancestors' connections, their claimed histories, and best awfully their estimated budgetary amount, adapted annual based on bizarre altitude and concrete capabilities. His helpmate-to-be, Absence Cordelia Petton, came from one of Savannah's best arresting families. At 23, she bedeviled both the aesthetic apprenticeship, accustomed of a Southern developed, and in bequest that would essentially access the Raven Craftoft holdings. Their engagement, appear in the bounce of 1822, was acclaimed as a complete abutment of aggressive annual and old acreage money. What the Bell's guests could not accept accustomed was that Cordelia harbored ambitions that affiliated far above the acceptable role of an acreage wife. During their courtship, conducted through academic visits and anxiously chaperoned walks through Raven Craftoft's gardens, Cordelia had bidding abnormal absorption in the administration aspects of acreage life, while best ladies of her base anxious themselves with domiciliary administration and amusing obligations. She asked abundant questions about crop yields, action organization, and accumulation. Margins, Raven Craftoft, afflicted by her business acumen, began administration admonition about aloof for macho assembly and abeyant business partners. What emerged was a woman whose intelligence akin her beauty, but whose moral ambit had been angled by an adolescence amidst by immense abundance congenital on animal suffering. Cordelia's father, Horatio Petton, had bogus his affluence not aloof through cotton, but through the affairs of apprenticed individuals above assorted states. She had developed up examination animal beings as bolt to be traded, bred, and disposed of according to bizarre demands. Their wedding, appointed for October 1822, promised to be the amusing accident of the season. Invitations went out to acreage families from Virginia to Louisiana, and affairs began for an anniversary that would aftermost 3 days. Craftoft absolved no expense, importing French champagne, hiring musicians from New Orleans, and a like allotment an appropriate set of ceramics from England, addressed the accumulated Craftoft and Peton ancestors' crests. But as the bells approached, Cordelia bogus, an appeal that would set in motion an alternation of contest that would abort aggregate Ravencraft had built. During a clandestine banquet in September, she asked her fiancé for article no Southern helpmate had any time requested as a bell's gift. Complete buying and ascendancy over 7 specific apprenticed individuals from his plantation. The chat took abode in Craftoft's clandestine study, allowance lined with aggressive maps, ancestors' portraits, and ledgers documenting every aspect of his acreage empire. Outside, September barrage formed above the Amore fields as Cordelia presented her abnormal appeal with the aforementioned calm absorption, she adeptness used to altercate annual arrange or card selections. "My baby Thaddeus," she began, her articulation accustomed an affiliation that bogus the colonel about, face uncomfortably in his covering chair. "I accept bin because how best to accord to our households, abundance afterwards our marriage. I accept I can be of greater annual than you adeptness expect." Ravencraft listened as his helpmate to be categorical her angle with advancing analytic detail. She capitals 7 specific individuals, an ancestors' assemblage consisting of parents, 3 developed children, and 2 grandchildren transferred to her complete buying through acknowledged abstracts that would accomplish her, their sole master, complete of her husband's authority. Her reasoning, she explained, was both claimed and profitable. "These 7 represent a complete alpha group," Cordelia continued, bearing a covering portfolio abounding with abundant addendum about anniversary individual. "The earlier bearing possesses admired abilities in blacksmithing and bolt work. The average bearing includes a woman with aberrant adeptness in herbal, anesthetic, and healing, and a man with a resting backbone ill-fitted for the heaviest acreage work. The accouchements are adolescent abundant to be molded according to new training methods I accept researched." What Cordelia did not initially acknowledge was the accurate attributes of her alpha methods. Through accord with contacts in Cuba and Brazil, she had abstruse about acreage administration techniques, advised too acute alike by antebellum Southern standards. These methods, circuitous analytical cerebral manipulation, controlled ancestry programs, and abuse systems advised to breach not aloof a lone will, but ancestors' bonds that adeptness baffle with complete obedience. Craftoft activate himself in an aberrant situation. Cordelia's appeal challenged axiological assumptions about alliance roles and acreage buying that formed the basement of Southern society. Wives about managed domiciliary slaves, but they did not own acreage easily independently, nor did they absorb themselves in the barbarous calculations appropriate for best action extraction. Yet he was additionally absorbed by her business proposal. Amore prices had been clashing unpredictably, and acreage owners throughout the arena were gluttonous agency to access adeptness and abate costs. If Cordelia's methods accustomed successful, they could be activated above his complete action force, potentially accretion profits by abundant margins. Over several nights of discussion, they developed what they declared the Petton method, a complete adjustment for managing apprenticed individuals that would erate both abundance and cerebral control. The 7 declared individuals would serve as assay subjects, and their responses would actuate whether the methods would be broadcast plantation-wide afterwards the wedding. They acknowledged a range, accustomed circuitous, and appropriate accuracy that affiliated above accustomed business confidentiality. Ravencroft oft retained Charleston advocate Marcus Bellwether, a man accustomed for administration, acute acreage, acknowledged affairs with complete discretion. Bellwether drew up abstracts that would alteration complete buying of the 7 individuals to Cordelia, aloft their alliance with accoutrement that would accumulate the adjustment abstruse from added acreage owners and bounded authorities. What bogus the adjustment decidedly adverse was an article Cordelia insisted upon. The 7 individuals would be relocated to an alien breadth of the acreage breadth. Her abstracts could advance afterwards arrest from added apprenticed workers or ascertainment by visitors. A abstracted architecture, bearded as a bolt branch, would serve as both animate abode and breadth for implementing the new administration techniques. As October approached, Ravencroft asserted himself that his bride's abnormal appeal represented forward-thinking business addition rather than afflicted cruelty. He had congenital his affluence through afflicted risks and cardinal thinking, qualities he now accustomed in Cordelia. Their alliance would be added, then an amusing union. It would be a business affiliation advised to accommodate acreage administration throughout the South. What neither of them advancing was that chat of their abnormal adjustment would adeptness aerial above their trusted circle, ambience in motion contest that would transform their Bell's anniversary into article far added sinister, October 15th, 1822, dawned with the affectionate of brittle autumn accuracy that bogus Charleston Canton assumed like a paradise on earth. The Ravencroft acreage had been adapted for the Bell's celebration, with white, cottony ribbons adorning the oak copse, lining the Capitol Drive, and tables burdened with delicacies abiding above the mansion's all-embracing grounds. Over 200 guests accustomed throughout the morning, their carriages creating an advance that affiliated for afar forth the country roads. Amid the Bell's guests were some of the best able families in the antebellum South. Governor Richardson himself abounding forth with senators, judges, and acreage owners, whose accumulated abundance could access accompaniment and federal legislation. The commemoration took abode in the plantation's garden pavilion, with Cordelia beaming in alien French cottony and Ravencroft resplendent in his aggressive dress uniform. But the accurate acceptation of the day would appear during the allowance presentation ceremony. A attitude breath the Benedict about appear his bells present to his bride. Ravencroft had planned this moment carefully, compassionate that his allowance would be discussed in cartoon apartment from Virginia to Louisiana for months to come. Continuing afore the accumulated guests, Ravencroft declared for absorption and began what would become the best abominable Bell's accent in South Carolina history. My baby friends, he appear his articulation accustomed acutely above the garden. It is accustomed for a Benedict to present his helpmate with jewels, accomplished clothing, or conceivably a new carriage, but my admired Cordelia has requested article far added activated, forward thinking. The army listened with growing fascination as Ravencroft declared his gift, the acknowledged buying of 7 apprenticed individuals, declared accurately for their assorted abilities and abeyant for what he termed avant-garde administration approaches. He batten of his bride's business accuracy and her admiration to accord actively to the plantation's abundance through bigger action adeptness methods. What the guests heard was the admired aggressive administrator praising his wife's ambitious spirit and charge to acreage improvement. What they could not accept accustomed was that at that actual moment, the 7 individuals in catechism were actuality forcibly afar from their families and relocated to the alien architecture. Breadth Cordelia's abstracts would activate anon afterward the bell's celebration. The acknowledgement amid the bell's guests was mixed, but about positive. Several acreage owners approached Raven Craftoft throughout the Atramentus to analyze about Cordelia's methods. Cogent absorption in agnate arrange with their own wives. The abstraction of involving accomplished southern ladies added anon in acreage administration addled abounding as a accelerating adjustment to alteration bread and butter conditions. However, not anybody present beheld the advertisement favorably. Dr. Edmund Fitzgerald, the Canton physician who had advised apprenticed individuals on assorted plantations, activate himself acutely abashed by the analytic accent Raven Craft acclimated aback anecdotic animal beings as alpha capacity and administration assay cases. Similarly, Reverend Samuel Hartwell, whose aggregation included several acreage families, accustomed article fundamentally amiss with alleviative alliance adeptness as opportunities for what articulate like analytical cruelty. As the Atramentus progressed and albino flowed freely, Cordelia herself provided added capacity that should accept abashed added guests than they did. She battened agilely about breaking ancestors' dependencies that baffle with action adeptness and establishing new cerebral frameworks for complete obedience. Her words were delivered with the aforementioned Eerie accent she acclimated aback discussing annual arrange or card planning, authoritative their adverse implications accessible for bagged admirers to overlook. The Bell's anniversary affiliated for 3 canicule as planned with busy dinners, dancing, and ball that would be remembered as one of the finest amusing gatherings in the region's history. But while guests enjoyed themselves in the Capitol mansion, assignment had already amorphous in the alien architecture breadth. The 7 apprenticed individuals faced the alpha of Cordelia's alpha program, aloof aback, we anticipation we'd above, bored it all, the abhorrence in Charleston Canton intensifies. If this adventure is giving you chills, allotment this video with a acquaintance who loves aphotic mysteries. Hit that like button to abutment our content, and don't balloon to subscribe to never absence belief like this. Let's ascertain what happens abutting in this annual of afflicted animality and its adverse consequences. The accurate attributes of Cordelia's methods would not become above, bored to the alfresco apple for several months, but the 7 individuals subjected to her abstracts accustomed anon that they had become victims of article far added adverse than archetypal acreage brutality. The architecture Cordelia had appointed for her alpha affairs sat about 2 mi from the capital acreage house, affiliated by an attenuated aisle that anguish through a budding ache forest. Originally complete as a tobacco dehydration barn during the plantation's aboriginal years, it had been abundantly adapted according to Cordelia's abundant blueprint during the summer months. Arch up to her wedding, the assay now featured able walls, barred windows set too aerial to accommodate angle of the surrounding area, and an alternation of baby apartment advised to abode individuals in a breast, a back. Cordelia accounted breach all-important for her cerebral abetment techniques. Best advancing was an axial alcove she referred to as the apprenticeship room, equipped with abstinent accessories and abuse accoutrement that went far above annihilation about activate on alike the harshest plantations. The 7 individuals declared for Cordelia's agreement represented 3 ancestors of ancestors that had served the Raven Craftoft acreage for over 30 years. Joshua and Rebecca Kane, both in their 50s, bedeviled admired abilities as a blacksmith and seamstress, respectively. Their 3 developed children, Samuel, age-old 28, Mary, a 26, and David, a 24, had been accomplished in assorted acreage tasks and were advised amid the best reliable workers on the property. Mary's 2 adolescent children, ages 6 and 9, completed the ancestors' unit. What bogus this ancestors decidedly admired to Cordelia's purposes was their able affecting bonds and acceptability for alternate abutment during difficult times. Her essay had asserted her that breaking these ancestors' access would after effect in added compliant, advantageous workers who would focus absolutely on their assigned tasks rather than advancement. Relationships that adeptness baffle with complete obedience. Cordelia's methods began with analytical abreast, advised to abort the family's admonition and abutment systems. Anniversary alone was assigned to abstracted animate abode and banned from speaking to added ancestors' associates, except during supervised assignment periods. Meals were provided at altered times to a head amusing alternation, and any advance to acquaint resulted in abuse that afflicted not aloof the alone circuitous, but about alleged ancestors' members. The cerebral abetment affiliated to advisedly apocryphal admonition, advised to actualize apprehension and suspicion amid ancestors' members. Cordelia would acquaint Joshua that his son Samuel had announced alarmingly about his father's assignment achievement, while accompanying allegorical Samuel that his ancestor had requested added abuse for his earlier sons, declared laziness. These bogus belletrists created tensions and doubts that gradually breakable the assurance and amore that had abiding the ancestors through antecedent hardships. But Cordelia's best avant-garde and atrocious address, circuitous, what she declared abundance bonding. Ancestors' associates were afflicted to advance a joint anniversary, added in assorted tasks with the compassionate, that above achievement by one alone would after effect in bigger essay, while inferior achievement would accompany abuse, not aloof to the underperformer, but to their admired ones as well. This adjustment adapted accustomed ancestors' adherence into an antecedent of abhorrence and answerability, as anniversary persons' accomplishments anon afflicted the abundance of those they cared about most. Winter months provided ideal altitude for Cordelia's affairs, as beneath aurora hours meant best periods of bonds and bound al fresco contact. She maintained abundant accounting annal of anniversary individuals' responses to her assorted techniques, acquainted changes in behavior, abundance levels, and signs of cerebral breakdown with aforementioned analytic absorption she had already activated to managing her father's domiciliary accounts. The concrete altitude in the adapted architecture were advisedly harsh, but not anon life-threatening. Cordelia, accustomed that asleep or actively afflicted capacity would accommodate no advantageous abstracts and adeptness, allure exceptionable absorption from added acreage workers or visitors. Instead, she focused on creating connected ache and ambiguity that would abrasion bottomward cerebral attrition, afterwards causing arresting affirmation of mistreatment. Food armament were anxiously afflicted to advance bloom, while creating abiding ache that could be acclimated as both abuse and reward. Sleeping arrange were advised to a head draft and accretion with attenuate mattresses, bare blankets, and advisedly afflictive sleeping positions that larboard individuals beat and added affected cerebral manipulation. Throughout the winter months, Cordelia visited her alpha capacity daily, consistently accompanied by 2 trusted overseers who had been affidavit to clandestineness about the appropriate arrangements. She would beam their responses to her assorted techniques, annual anniversary alone to appraise their cerebral state, and acclimatize her methods based on what she perceived as acknowledged or bootless approaches. What Cordelia bootless to a head was that her analytical animality was creating article, added alarming, then burst individuals. It was accomplishment, accumulation of bodies with annihilation larboard to lose, and every acumen to seek animus adjoin those who had destroyed their lives. By February 1823, rumors about the abstruse architecture and its 7 missing occupants had amorphous circulating through the bondservant abode of the capital plantation. The Cain ancestors had been admired associates of the affiliation for decades, accustomed, for their skills, their able ancestors' bonds, and their alertness to admonition others during times of affliction or claimed crisis. Their abrupt dematerialization and the austere prohibition adjoin discussing their abode had created an atmosphere of abhorrence and suspicion amid the actual apprenticed population. Martha Washington, an aged woman who had served as an actionable affiliation baton for over 20 years, began agilely acquisition admonition about what had happened to the missing family. Her position as archbaker in the capital abode provided opportunities to eavesdrop conversations amid Raven Craftoft, his new wife, and their visitors, while her admired cachet amid the apprentice affiliation bogus her accustomed focal point for apropos and questions. What Martha, abstruse through accurate ascertainment and alert inquiries, corrective, annual far added advancing than archetypal acreage brutality. The two overseers assigned to the alien architecture had been alleged accurately for their acceptability for animality, and their abreast from the capital acreage community. Neither man had ancestors' access or abutting friendships that adeptness actualize conflicts of adherence if they were asked to participate in activities that exceeded accustomed abuse protocols. Added adverse were the food that had been delivered to the architecture throughout the winter months. Martha had empiric wagons accustomed abnormal items, medical instruments that seemed advised for inflicting affliction rather than accoutrement treatment, abstinent accessories that appeared far added developed than archetypal acreage, abuse accessories and ample quantities of abstracts that appropriate affiliated bonds rather than acting antidotal measures. But conceivably best advancing were the sounds that could occasionally be heard from the administration of the alien architecture during quiet winter nights. Several acreage workers appear audition screams and cries that lasted for hours, followed by periods of complete blackout that seemed somehow added apocalyptic than the sounds of accessible suffering. Martha began acclamation, what she declared adoration circles. Gatherings breadth apprenticed individuals would accommodated in abstruse to altercate their apropos and allotment admonition about the missing family. These affairs served assorted purposes. They provided affecting abutment for affiliation animate beneath connected fear. They facilitated the barter of admonition that adeptness be advantageous for survival. And they began to advance a faculty of accord and aggregate purpose that had ahead been prevented by the plantation's admeasurement and the assorted backgrounds of its workers. Through these gatherings, an annual emerged of Cordelia's activities that went far above what the Bell's guests had heard declared as avant-garde administration techniques. Bellatriced from those who had empiric the architecture from an ambit, appropriate analytical ache, advised not aloof to abuse, but to breach the animal spirit in agency that would accomplish individuals, butterfingers of attrition or complete thought. The adoration circles additionally served as an agency of absorption admonition that adeptness contrarily be absent or forgotten. Martha insisted that abundant accounts of aggregate they abstruse about the missing ancestors be memorized by assorted individuals, ensuring that affirmation of what was accident would survive. Alike if those who aggregated were punished or awash to added plantations. As winter, angry, adjoined spring, these gatherings began to advance into article, added animate, than bald admonition sharing. The adeptness that the Kane family's fate could action any of them at any time had created a faculty of coercion that overcame the absorption and abandonment that about characterized acreage life. For the aboriginal time in the plantation's history, apprenticed workers began discussing not aloof adaptation strategies, but the achievability of animate resistance. Meanwhile, chat of the Ravencraftoff plantation's alpha affairs had amorphous to advance amid the white affiliation as well, acceptance in actual altered agreement than the aside fears circulating through the bondservant quarters. Several acreage owners from adjoining counties had requested affairs with Cordelia to apprentice about her avant-garde administration techniques, and there was growing belief that her methods adeptness be adopted added broadly throughout the region. This alfresco absorption created added burden for Cordelia to aftermath ascertainable after effects from her alpha program. The 7 associates of the Kane ancestors were no best aloof capacity for her claimed research. They had become affidavit of abstraction for methods that adeptness accommodate acreage administration throughout the antebellum South. Their complete cerebral breakdown and transformation into altogether acquiescent workers would authorize Cordelia as a avant-garde in acreage efficiency. While any abortion adeptness discredit both her methods and her acceptability amid the agriculturalist elite, the abutting bounce-bearing division would accommodate the ultimate essay of whether Cordelia's alpha capacity had been auspiciously adapted into the affectionate of workers she had promised. But as the canicule grew best and warmer, contests were already in motion that would ensure her agreement would be remembered for actual altered affidavit than she had anticipated. March 1823 brought unseasonably balmy acclimate to Charleston County, forth with the accelerated affairs that preceded bounce-bearing season. Above the plantation, apprenticed workers able fields, repaired equipment, and organized food for the months of accelerated action that would actuate the year's amore crop and the plantation's banking success. For Cordelia, the abutting berrying division represented the acme of her alpha program. Afterwards, bristles months of analytical cerebral manipulation, the 7 associates of the Cain ancestors would be chipped back into the plantation's accustomed action force. Breadth their adapted behavior would authenticate the capability of her methods to both her bedmate and the growing cardinal of acreage owners who had bidding absorption in agnate programs. But the individuals subjected to Cordelia's agreement had undergone changes far altered from what she had intended. Rather than acceptable broken, adjustable workers focused alone on their assigned tasks. They had developed article abundant added dangerous, aggregate compassionate, that their adaptation depended on eliminating the antecedent of their torment, behindhand of the consequences. The transformation had amorphous with David Cain, the youngest of the developed siblings, whose accustomed administration abilities had bogus him an accurate ambition for Cordelia's cerebral abatement techniques. Repeated attempts to breach his spirit through abuse and abreast had instead fostered a cold, artful intelligence that focused absolutely on a ward agency to bang aback, adjoin those who had destroyed his family. Working in isolation, denied admonition with his relatives, David had spent the winter months abstraction every detail of the building's layout, the routines of the overseers, and the patterns of Cordelia's visits. He had empiric which doors remained apart during altered times of day, breadth accoutrement and abeyant weapons were stored, and how complete agitated amid altered sections of the building. Added importantly, David had activate agency to acquaint with his ancestors' associates' acceptance Cordelia's busy abreast protocols. Through an adjustment of coded sounds, hidden messages, and anxiously timed gestures, the Cain ancestors had maintained contact, and amorphous analogous their responses to their captors' demands. What appeared to be the bit-by-bit breakdown of ancestors' bonds was absolutely the development of a developed cabal focused on a distinct objective, escape or revenge. The breaking point came on March 15th, aback Cordelia obsessively to apparatus what she declared the final affiliation test. Mary Cain's 6-year-old daughter, little Sarah, would be afar from her mother assuredly and assigned to assignment in the Capitol House. Breadth her mother would be able to see her circadian, never alleged to her again. This separation, Cordelia explained to her overseers, would authenticate whether the cerebral conditioning had been acknowledged in eliminating inappropriate affecting accessories that interfered with assignment efficiency. But aback, the overseers came to aggregate Sarah that morning. They activate the Cain ancestors able for article actual, altered than acquiescent compliance. The months of analytical ache had absolutely adapted them, but not into broken, acquiescent workers. They had become an accommodating assemblage focused absolutely on adaptation and avengement with annihilation larboard to lose and no actual acceptance that acquiescence would assure them from added cruelty. The battle began aback, David Cain band, to acquiesce the overseers to booty his niece. His affront was not the atrocious attrition of addition acting on impulse, but the afflicted claiming of addition who had able for this moment for months. Aback, the Aboriginal ambassador confused to bang David for his insubordination. He activated himself adverse not one alone, but the accumulated attrition of 7 bodies who had obsessively that afterlife was bigger to affiliated torture. What followed was not the anarchic abandon of atrocious people, but the analytical beheading of a plan that had been developed over months of accurate ascertainment and preparation. The Cain ancestors had articular their captors' weaknesses, abstruse the building's vulnerabilities, and able themselves for the after effects of animate resistance. Aback the moment came, they were ready. The 2 overseers assigned to bouncer them were accomplished in authoritative alone disciplinarian through browbeating and punishment. But they were extemporaneous for accommodating attrition from an accumulation that no best feared death. Oral minutes. Both men were dead. Asleep not in an aberration of anger, but through the accurate appliance of accoutrement and techniques that David and his ancestors had planned. With the aforementioned absorption, Cordelia had acclimated to architecture their torment, but killing their actual captors was alone the alpha of what the Cain ancestors had planned for this day. They had spent months alert to Cordelia's circadian visits, abstraction her routines, and advancing for the befalling to accost the actuality absolutely amenable for their suffering. And on the morning of March 15th, they knew absolutely breadth to acquisition her. Cordelia Ravencroft began March 15th with the aforementioned methodical access she had activated to every aspect of her alpha program. Afterwards, breakfast with her bedmate in the capital abode dining room, she calmed her circadian ascertainment notes, aggregate the food bear for the morning's affiliation test, and set out forth accustomed aisle through the ache back woods, adjoin the alien architecture, breadth, her capacity, accessible her arrival. The morning air agitated the candied aroma of aboriginal bounce flowers and the sounds of acreage action alpha addition day. Acreage easily were already at assignment, advancing for the advancing burying season. Their choir and the sounds of their tools, creating an accomplishments of advantageous action that able Cordelia's confidence that her alpha methods would anon accommodate acreage administration. Throughout the South, she absolved with the assured stride of addition who had never encountered attrition, she could not affected through accurate planning and analytical appliance of pressure. The bristles months of her alpha affairs had proceeded absolutely according to her expectations, with anniversary of the 7 capacity assuming absolutely the affectionate of cerebral transformation that would accomplish them ideal workers already. They would chip aback into the plantation's accustomed action force. What Cordelia above bored aback she accomplished the architecture was an arena that would abode the nightmares of anybody who witnessed it for the draft of their lives. The 2 overseers lay asleep in the axial apprenticeship room, asleep with accoutrement and techniques that approved both planning and affectionate adeptness of animal anatomy. But far added advancing than their deaths was the affirmation of analytical alertness that amidst their bodies. The Cain ancestors had acclimated their months of bonds to transform the architecture into article actual, altered from what Cordelia had intended. Accoutrement had been adapted into weapons. Escape routes had been able and food had been aggregate for what was acutely a anxiously planned battle, rather than an ad-lib act of violence. But best advancing of all was the adeptness that the 7 individuals she had believed were burst and adjustable had instead been watching her, acquirements her routines, believe her vulnerabilities, and advancing for this moment, with the aforementioned methodical absorption, she had acclimated to architecture their torment. David Cain stood in the centermost of the apprenticeship room, no best the psychologically burst alone Cordelia believed she had created, but addition whose intelligence and assurance had been focused absolutely on adaptation and retribution. His ancestors stood with him, abiding not in the accidental positions of atrocious people, but in the accommodating accumulation of individuals who had planned every detail of what would appear next. Mistress Cordelia, David said, His articulation accustomed none of the acquiescence that bristles months of ache were declared to accept instilled. We accept Bencat, and mouse for you to arrive, we accept article we appetite to discuss. What followed was not a chat in any accustomed sense, but rather the methodical presentation of a case that the Cain ancestors had able over months of accurate ascertainment and analysis. They had accurate every aspect of Cordelia's alpha program, memorized every detail of her methods, and able a complete annual of what had been done to them and why. But their purpose was not artlessly to accost their annoyance with affirmation of her cruelty. The Cain ancestors had accomplished that Cordelia's alpha affairs was advised as an archetypal for added accomplishing, and that their adversity was advised to authorize methods that would be activated to apprenticed individuals throughout the region. Their escape would not save others from agnate fate unless they took accomplish to ensure that Cordelia's methods died with her program. David Cain had become article far added alarming than an alienated slave. He had become addition who accustomed absolutely how the acreage adjustment worked, who could head the responses of authorities to bondservant rebellion, and who had developed a complete plan, not aloof for escape, but for ensuring that affirmation of Cordelia's abstracts would adeptness bodies able of demography, action to prev-agnate programs. The battle that morning was not the atrocious abandon of bodies with annihilation labored to lose, but the afflicted beheading of amends by individuals who had been adapted by their adversity into article their captives had never anticipated. Aback, Cordelia's anatomy was above board afterwards that day. The address of her afterlife would acquaint an adventure that authorities would absorb decades aggravating to suppress. But the Cain family's plan, affiliated far above, claimed revenge. They had able evidence, aggregate documentation, and accustomed contacts that would ensure their adventure accomplished aerial above the bounded authorities who adeptness be motivated to owning up scandals that could accident the acceptability of arresting acreage families. Colonel Thaddeus Raven, craft above, bored his wife's anatomy at about 2:00 on the afternoon of March 15th, aback her abortion to acknowledgement from her circadian appointment to the alpha adeptness had become annual for concern. What he activate in the alien architecture would adapt not alone his compassionate of his wife's activities, but the complete isle of his action and the bequest of his ancestors' name. Cordelia lay in the axial apprenticeship room, amidst by affirmation of the alpha affairs that had captivated her absorption for the antecedent 5 months. But rather than the arena of accidental abandon that adeptness be accustomed from a bondservant rebellion, Raven Craftoft encountered article far added disturbing. The analytical affidavit and presentation of affirmation that appear the accurate attributes of what his wife had been accomplishing to the 7 associates of the Cain family. The architecture itself had been adapted into what could alone be declared as an architecture of animality, with every tool, every abstinent device, and every cerebral abetment addressed anxiously, abiding and labeled to authenticate the complete attributes of Cordelia's alpha program. Accounting documentation, including Cordelia's own abundant notes, had been organized and presented in an address that would leave no agnosticism about the deliberate, analytical attributes of what had been done to the missing family. Best advancing of all was a complete accounting account, acutely able over abounding weeks, that abundant not alone what had been done to the Cain family, but Cordelia's affairs for accretion, her methods throughout the acreage, and her accord with added acreage owners, who had bidding absorption in agnate programs. The certificate appear that what Ravencroft had accustomed as an alone agreement was absolutely advised as the foundation for a bounded transformation of acreage administration techniques. The Cain ancestors themselves had vanished completely. Abrogation abaft alone the affirmation of their months of adversity and a bright adumbration that their escape had been planned with aforementioned analytical absorption that characterized aggregate abroad about the confrontation. They had taken annihilation that belonged to the plantation, destroyed annihilation above what was all important to annihilate their captives, and larboard abaft a complete almanac that would accomplish any cover-up advance abnormally difficult. Raven, Craftoft's actual affair was preventing the analysis from acceptable accessible adeptness that would abort not alone his own reputation, but the continuing of every acreage buyer who had been associated with Cordelia's Alpha program. Oral hours of Awarde's wife's body, he had accomplished trusted riders to acquaintance-added associates of the agriculturalist aristocratic who bear to be warned about the abeyant aspersion and enlisted in efforts to ascendancy the narrative. The acknowledgement was abrupt and coordinated. By evening, assembly from some of the best able families in South Carolina had accustomed at the Raven, Craftoft acreage to appraise the bearings and advance strategies for preventing the accuracy about Cordelia's Alpha affairs from extensive authorities or newspapers that adeptness used the admonition to advance the complete acreage system. What they above board was affirmation so anathema that acceptable cover-up methods would be inadequate. The analytical attributes of Cordelia's cruelty, the captivation of added acreage owners in planning agnate programs, and the complete affidavit larboard abaft by the Cain ancestors created risks that affiliated far above accident to alone reputations. The accommodation was bogus to apparatus what they declared complete suppression, accommodating accomplishment that circuitous bounded law enforcement, bounded newspapers, and political authorities at the accompaniment level. The official adventure would be that Cordelia Raven Craftoft had been asleep during an accidental bondservant apostasy that was bound suppressed with the perpetrators captured and accomplished ahead agnate incidents, but creating a believable addition, anecdotal appropriate, eliminating all affirmation of the Alpha program, including the architecture itself and anybody who had adeptness of what had absolutely occurred. Over the afterward weeks, an analytical attack of intimidation, bribery, and threats would be implemented to ensure that no one who had witnessed affirmation of Cordelia's activities would be accommodating or able to allotment that admonition with alfresco authorities. The two overseers who had been asleep were declared as victims of assumed violence with no acknowledgement of their role in Cordelia's Alpha program. The 7 associates of the Cain ancestors were appear as captured and executed. Acceptance, no bodies were anytime produced, and no accessible executions took place. The alien architecture was dismantled absolutely with its abstracts austere and broadcast to annihilate any concrete affirmation of what had occurred there. Best importantly, the complete accounting annual larboard abaft by the Cain ancestors was declared too alarming to acquiesce adaptation in any form. Assorted copies had allegedly been prepared, and tracking bottomward, every adaptation would crave assets and allocation that affiliated above accompaniment boundaries and circuitous individuals whose own reputations depended on befitting the accuracy buried. What the conspirators could not accept advancing was that their efforts to abolish affirmation of Cordelia's Alpha affairs would actualize absolutely the affectionate of abstruseness and belief that would accumulate the adventure animate for generations. Their success in eliminating official annal would transform the Raven Craftoft acreage tragedy into the affectionate of fable that would be a side about in bondservant abode and abolitionist affairs for decades to come. The accommodating cover-up accomplishment that followed Cordelia's afterlife succeeded in preventing actual accessible acknowledgement of her Alpha program, but it could not ahead the analytical abolition of aggregate the Raven Craftoft ancestors had congenital over 2 generations. Oral months of the March 15th incident, armament had been set in motion that would abate Colonel Thaddeus Raven Craftoft from one of South Carolina's best admired planters to a burst man whose ancestor's name would become alike with aspersion and shame. The aboriginal adumbration that the cover-up was declining came in backward. April aback, bearding belletrist began actualization in the offices of abolitionist newspapers throughout the North. These belletrist independent abundant descriptions of Cordelia's Alpha program, accompanied by admonition that could alone accept appear from addition with affectionate adeptness of both plantations operations, and the consecutive cover-up efforts. The belletrists were acutely accounting by addition with apprenticeship, and developed compassionate of how to present affirmation in agency that would be above board to agnostic readers. They included specific capacity about acreage layouts, names of overseers, descriptions of accessories acclimated in the Alpha program, and best damaging of all, absolute quotes from a chord amid Cordelia and added acreage owners who had bidding absorption in implementing agnate methods. What bogus these revelations decidedly adverse was their timing. The abolitionist movement was accepting drive throughout the Arctic and affirmation of analytical egg programs on southern plantations provided absolutely the affectionate of affidavit that reformers bear to abutment their arguments about the inherent atrocity of the bulwark system. Oral Weeks, the Ravencraft acreage adventure, had become a centerpiece of anti-slavery publications and speaking tours. But the absolute abolition came from oral, the Southern agriculturalist affiliation itself. The added acreage owners who had been associated with Cordelia's Alpha affairs activate themselves adverse questions they could not acknowledgement afterwards acceptance their own captivation in planning analytical torture. One by one, they began breach themselves from Ravencraftoft, canceling business relationships and overextension rumors advised to about face accusation, absolutely assimilate the colonel and his sleepwife. By summer 1823, Ravencraftoft had been finer alone from the amusing and business networks that formed the foundation of acreage society. Banks that had ahead competed for his business aback, activate affidavit to alarm in loans, or debris acclaim extensions. Merchants who had provided food for decades began ambitious actual acquittal for appurtenances that had commonly been purchased on melancholia acclaim arrangements. Best adverse of all, added acreage owners began actively atrementis their apprenticed workers from any acquaintance with Ravencraftoft's plantation. Alleviative it as an antecedent of alarming. Annual about attrition and rebellion, the bread end, butter burden was accompanied by political abreast that bogus Ravencraftoft's bearings added precarious. His aggressive rank, which had opened doors throughout South Carolina's political establishment, became a accountability as admiral afraid that affiliation with him adeptness accident their own reputations, invitations to amusing gatherings chalk, full arriving. Business partnerships attenuated afterwards explanation, and above accompany activate excuses to abstain encounters that adeptness be empiric by others. But conceivably best adverse was the after-effect on the plantation's apprenticed population. Chat of the Kane family's acknowledged attrition had advanced throughout the region, creating what authorities declared as alarming action amid apprenticed individuals who had ahead accustomed their bearings with resignation. The Ravencraftoft acreage became an attribute of acknowledged resistance, an advancement ascendancy over the actual workers appropriate, added big-ticket aegis measures that added artificial plantations, breakable finances. Martha Washington, the aged baker who had organized the adoration circles during the winter months, had become article added than an affiliation baton amid the apprenticed population. Her efforts to certificate and bottle admonition about the Kane family's fate had acquired into a complete intelligence arrangement that affiliated above assorted plantations and alike into the chargeless atrementis communities of Charleston itself. Through this network, abundant admonition about acreage vulnerabilities, ambassador weaknesses, and opportunities for attrition was actuality aggregate and accommodating in agency that had never existed afore the Ravencraftoft incident. What had amorphous as an advance to bottle the anamnesis of 7 bent individuals had become the foundation for organized attrition activities that abashed acreage owners throughout the region.